Okay, so get ready because we are diving into some seriously wild territory today in the world of international relations. And you're not going to believe this. Somebody out there thinks that Canada should just become part of the U.S.
You know, it's even crazier. It's not just some random person on the internet. This suggestion actually came from former President Trump.
I know, right? It's mind-blowing. So our deep dive today is all about this CBC News video, and it features Congressman Seth Magaziner. And get this, he's actually introduced a bill called the No Invading Allies Act.
Yeah.
Like, seriously, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, what in the world happened that a sitting congressman felt the need to propose something like that?
Well, it all stems back to Trump's idea that annexing Canada would be the easiest way to solve any trade disputes between the two countries. He even went so far as to say something about getting rid of that artificial line between the U.S. and Canada, and how aesthetically pleasing he thought the combined land masses of the U.S., Canada, and even Greenland would look all as one.
Hold on, aesthetically pleasing. Is he talking about redrawing international borders based on how it looks on a map? I mean, it's like he's playing a game of Risk and decided to just go for world domination.
Yeah, certainly a unique approach to international relations, to say the least. But the question is, has any other U.S. president in modern times ever seriously considered annexing a neighboring country?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm wondering. Like, is this just classic Trump being Trump? Or is there actually some kind of historical precedent for this kind of talk?
Well, the idea of annexing Canada has been floated around before, mostly in the 19th century, but, the world was a very different place back then. To actually annex a developed and democratic nation like Canada in modern times, I mean, that would be completely unprecedented.
Okay, so this No Invading Allies Act, what's the deal with that? Like, what exactly is it supposed to do, and why did Congressman Magaziner feel so strongly about introducing it?
So this act aims to prevent the U.S. from using military force to annex territories that belong to its allies. It even names Canada, Panama, and Greenland specifically.
Mm.
And the reason Magaziner felt it was necessary, well, it actually goes back to Trump's inaugural speech, where he actually hinted at wanting to expand U.S. territory.
Wait, he actually said that, like, go out and grab more land.
Not in those exact words, but the implication was definitely there. And that raises a really important question about the balance of power between the president and Congress when it comes to military action and territorial expansion. Like, does a president actually have the power to just go around annexing other countries?
Okay, so you're the expert here. Help me out. Can he actually just do that? I mean, doesn't Congress have a say in things like declaring war?
You're right. The U.S. Constitution does give Congress the power to declare war. However, over time, Congress has actually granted presidents more and more leeway to take military action without their explicit authorization, at least for a limited time.
So it's kind of a gray area then.
Exactly, and that's exactly where Congressman Magaziner's bill comes in. He's arguing that Trump's actions, they really show the need to put a tighter leash on presidential power. He's essentially saying, look, if a president can even just casually talk about taking over another country, then we really need to clarify who actually has the authority to do that. And on top of that, he even cites polls that show that the idea of invading allies is incredibly unpopular with the American public.
So if this isn't just about, Trump kind of flexing his presidential muscles, what's the real game here? What do you think he was hoping to achieve with this kind of rhetoric?
Well, there are a few possibilities. Some people argue that it was just a tactic to pressure Canada into making concessions in trade negotiations, essentially a power play. Others see it as a way to distract from problems here at home, or even just a way to appeal to a certain segment of his base who might respond to that kind of tough talk.
Speaking of trade, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this whole trade war situation. We all know there's been some back and forth with tariffs. Can you, break down the specifics of what actually happened?
Absolutely. It all started with Trump slapping tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, citing national security concerns.
National security! Come on, Canada.
Right. But that's what he went with. And of course, Canada retaliated, hitting a whole range of U.S. goods with their own tariffs. And then things got even more interesting when Ontario, which is Canada's largest province, they added a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to a few U.S. states: Michigan, Minnesota, and New York.
Whoa, that's gotta hurt, especially for those states relying on that electricity. So what did Trump do then?
Well, being Trump, he responded with a threat naturally. He threatened to jack up the steel and aluminum tariffs to a whopping 50%. Things got a little frantic after that, with Ontario eventually suspending the surcharge and Canadian officials rushing to Washington to try and smooth things over.
Sounds like one big roller coaster of economic uncertainty. So what does that kind of back and forth do to businesses and, regular people like us on both sides of the border?
Well, first off, it creates a ton of instability. Businesses can't plan investments when the rules of the game keep changing like that, and for everyday people, prices go up as those tariffs get passed on to consumers. Not to mention, the stock markets tend to freak out whenever trade tensions flare up.
So essentially a recipe for disaster for everyone. So is this kind of trade war actually a sustainable strategy? What are the long-term consequences likely to be?
Well, in the long run, trade wars almost never benefit anyone. They mess up supply chains, make the economy less efficient, and ultimately it's the consumers who end up paying the price.
Okay, so if it's so bad for everyone, why keep doing it? What's the solution here? How do we climb out of this mess?
Ideally, both sides would swallow their pride, sit down at the negotiating table, and hammer out a deal that works for everyone. But let's be real, given the current political climate, that's not looking too likely, is it?
So we're stuck in this standoff. It feels like we're doomed to economic chaos. Is there any hope here?
Not necessarily. While things are definitely tense right now, there are a few glimmers of hope. One possibility is that the economic pain from the trade war could eventually force both sides to rethink their strategy.
You're saying that even the most stubborn politicians will have to back down if things get bad enough.
Exactly. Plus, there's the upcoming midterm elections in the U.S. To consider those could shake things up in Congress and potentially put more pressure on Trump to take a less aggressive approach.
That's an interesting point. So what about the Republicans? Have they been voicing any concerns about Trump's actions in all of this?
That's where things get really interesting. While some Republicans have expressed reservations privately, public criticism of Trump has been pretty muted.
Why so quiet? Are they afraid to speak out against him?
There are a few factors at play here.
Hmm.
Some Republicans genuinely agree with Trump's policies. Others might be hesitant to criticize him publicly because they don't want to alienate his base, especially with the midterms coming up. It's a delicate balancing act for them, for sure.
So a mix of political pressure and maybe a little self-preservation.
Exactly. The Republican Party is walking a tightrope right now. They need to stay unified, but they also need to address the concerns of their constituents, many of whom are feeling the pinch from this trade war.
Okay, so the midterms could be a major turning point in all of this.
Potentially, it all comes down to how the voters react. If the economic pain continues and they start pointing fingers at the Republicans, we could see a real shift in the political landscape. It all depends on whether voters are willing to put up with the consequences of this trade war.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were really getting into like all the details of this trade war and how it's been affecting both the US and Canada. But to really like understand what's going on, I think we need to zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely. To
Yeah.
really understand the current situation, you're right, we need to consider the historical context and, all those broader geopolitical forces that are at play.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. We've talked about, Trump's idea about annexing Canada, but has the US ever seriously considered absorbing a neighboring country in, modern times? Are there any like historical parallels that we can maybe look at?
Well, the U.S. definitely has a very, long and complex history when it comes to territorial expansion. But to like outright annex a developed, democratic neighbor like Canada would be completely unprecedented in modern times.
Hmm.
I mean, there was some, whispers and talks about annexing Canada way back in the 19th century,
Yeah.
but that was a completely different era, and like the whole geopolitical dynamics were very different back then.
So Trump's suggestion really is breaking new ground, huh? What about the idea of using, economic pressure as a way to kind of gain territory? Are there any historical echoes of that?
That's where things get a little bit, murky. Economic coercion has definitely been a tool in foreign policy for centuries, but it's typically been used to influence a country's behavior, not necessarily to like outright absorb it. So this whole situation with Canada feels different.
So is this just another example of Trump being Trump, like just throwing out crazy ideas without any real plan? Or could there actually be a deeper strategy going on here? I mean, what do you think?
Well, it's honestly impossible to know for sure what's going on inside Trump's head, but I think we can try to analyze the situation,
Mm.
and think about what are the potential benefits that he might have seen in this approach.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate for a minute here. What possible advantage could Trump see in, bringing up all this talk about, annexing Canada?
Well, one possibility is that it was just a distraction tactic, creating controversy and, dominating all the news cycles with all these provocative statements allowed him to divert attention away from other pressing issues, both at home and abroad.
Hmm.
It's a way to kind of control the narrative and what people are talking about.
That definitely sounds like a classic Trump move, but I mean, is there more to it than just, trying to grab headlines? Could there be like a bigger game at play here?
Another possibility, and this is where it gets a little bit unsettling, is that he was testing the waters, gauging how people react, both the American public and the international community, just kind of seeing how far he could push the boundaries.
Testing the waters for what exactly? Surely not an actual invasion.
A military invasion of Canada. Extremely unlikely.
Okay.
But by, throwing out this idea, even if it was just a joke or offhand, he might have been trying to normalize this idea of territorial expansion and kind of start to erode those long-standing norms of international relations that we've all come to rely on.
So he's trying to shift the Overton window. Is that what that's called? Basically pushing the boundaries of what's considered, acceptable in global politics.
Exactly. The Overton window is the range of ideas and policies that are considered, acceptable in public discourse. And by introducing these really radical ideas, even if people don't immediately jump on board, you can kind of gradually shift that window and make things that were once unthinkable start to seem more palatable over time.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful and potentially dangerous concept. What are the long-term implications of that kind of rhetoric and behavior, on the global stage?
Well, in the long run, this type of rhetoric can really undermine, trust and cooperation between countries. It can embolden those authoritarian leaders and even weaken international institutions like the United Nations
Mm.
that have helped to keep things peaceful and stable for decades.
So we're talking about a potential, unraveling of the whole global order, like the world as we know it could be at stake.
Well, it's not an exaggeration to say that the rules-based international system that we kind of came up with after World War II is definitely under pressure, from all sides. And this kind of behavior just disregards those norms to keep things stable and really just makes things worse,
Yeah.
throws everything into question.
Okay, so let's try to wrap our heads around all this. We have, a former president who suggested annexing Canada, sparked this trade war with our closest ally, and really just seems to be playing fast and loose with these international norms that, are supposed to keep everything running smoothly. Where does that leave the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, and what are the potential long-term consequences for both countries?
Well, the U.S.-Canada relationship has definitely gone through, a lot of ups and downs over the years, but this is definitely one of the most challenging periods we've seen recently. The erosion of trust and the economic fallout from this trade war will have lasting consequences for both countries.
And beyond just the immediate economic and political fallout, what about the intangible impacts on the relationship, those shared values and those really close cultural ties, that long history of cooperation, can that be easily repaired?
That's a really important point. Those intangible bonds are what have always made the U.S.-Canada relationship so special, but they're not immune to being damaged. Those repeated breaches of trust, all that hostile rhetoric can really eat away at even the strongest relationships. And it takes time and effort to rebuild that sense of trust and goodwill.
So we're talking about a potential fracturing of this partnership that has been, the cornerstone of North American stability and prosperity for generations. That's a pretty scary thought.
It is a very sobering thought and a possibility that we need to think about. The decisions that are made in the coming months and years will have a profound impact on the future of this really important relationship. So it's a critical moment for both countries.
Wow, this has been a very heavy but incredibly insightful conversation. It feels like we've covered so much, but there's still so much more to unpack here.
Absolutely. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of how complex international relations are and,
Mm.
all the powerful geopolitical forces that are shaping our world.
Well, on that note, let's take a quick pause to process all of this information. And when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into some of the key takeaways from this discussion and explore some potential scenarios for what the future holds for the U.S.-Canada relationship. So don't go anywhere.
And we're back. And I don't know about you, but after that last segment, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. It's
Yeah.
like everything we thought was, stable and predictable in the world is suddenly up in the air.
Yeah, it's true. We're living in a time of huge change and a lot of uncertainty. Those old rules of the game, they're definitely being challenged. And we're seeing a real shift in, the global balance of power. It's a lot to
Yes.
process.
So let's try to make some sense of it all. We've really gone deep into this whole Canada annexation thing.
Yeah.
What are some of the big takeaways for you? What should we as the listeners, be paying attention to? Well, I think the first and most important takeaway is that we need to be vigilant. We can't just assume that, our democratic institutions and all these international norms are just going to be there forever.
Yeah.
They need to be actively defended and reinforced.
It's kind of a wake-up call, even in countries like the US and Canada, where we think things are pretty stable, things can change really fast, and all of a sudden, the unthinkable is on the table.
Exactly. And the second big takeaway is just how interconnected the world really is.
Mm.
What happens in one part of the world, it has ripple effects everywhere else. And this trade war between the U.S. and Canada is a perfect example of that.
It's not just about, tariffs and trade deficits, right? It's about real people's lives and the stability of entire economies and, these delicate balances of power on the global stage.
Exactly. And it really just underscores how important international cooperation and diplomacy are, in a world that's as complex as ours.
Mhm.
Trying to go it alone is just not a viable strategy. We need each other.
So, where do we go from here? What are some of the possible scenarios for the future? I mean, laid on us, best case, worst case, and everything in between.
Okay, let's start with the most optimistic scenario in a perfect world. Cooler heads would prevail. Both sides would come back to the table,
Hmm.
willing to negotiate in good faith, and they would come up with a trade agreement that benefits everyone. All this talk about annexation would just kind of fade away, and the U.S.-Canada relationship would, slowly but surely get back to normal.
That does sound lovely, but honestly, given how things are right now politically, it feels a little too good to be true, doesn't it? What's a more realistic outlook?
Okay, well, a more likely scenario is that we'll see, more turbulence. The trade war drags on, tensions stay high, and the relationship between the two countries, remains pretty strained. This could even lead to a gradual decoupling of their economies, which would have significant long-term consequences for both sides.
And what about the worst case scenario? What's the nightmare scenario we should be prepared for?
Well, the worst-case scenario is that things escalate even further,
Yeah.
maybe sparked by some unforeseen event, and this could lead to, a breakdown in communication, miscalculations, and even military posturing.
Yeah.
Scary thought, but, we can't ignore the possibility.
Okay, I think we've had enough doom and gloom for one day. Can we talk about solutions? What can we as individuals do to prevent, those worst case scenarios from actually happening?
Well, I think first and foremost, we need to stay informed,
Yeah.
pay attention to what's happening in the world, engage in, constructive dialogue about these issues and hold our leaders accountable for their actions. We can also support organizations that are, working to promote diplomacy and understanding and cooperation between nations.
And maybe stock up on some maple syrup, just in case.
Hey, it never hurts to be prepared.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of another deep dive. This one has been particularly eye-opening, to say the least. It's made me realize that even things that seem totally outlandish can become, real possibilities in today's world.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that we need to be prepared for the unexpected and, stay engaged in shaping the kind of future that we want to see. We can't just sit back and assume that things will work themselves out.
Absolutely. And a huge thank you to you for guiding us through this complex and fascinating and honestly a little scary topic.
Mhm.
Your insights have been really valuable.
It's been my pleasure. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having.
And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive, as thought-provoking as we have. And we encourage you to check out the full CBC News video for more context and, to keep exploring this really important topic.
And remember, the future isn't set in stone. We all have a role to play in shaping it.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay tuned for another deep dive into the most fascinating corners of knowledge.